Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti al Circolo del Design. Parlo al microfono perché siamo contemporaneamente in streaming. Stasera abbiamo un appuntamento che fa parte della nostra programmazione culturale di questo anno, che si intitola Design Together Now e che ha voluto nell'arco di questi mesi, attraverso una serie di appuntamenti, talk diversi, da maggio ad oggi, approfondire quali fossero e come il design può dare delle risposte alle nuove esigenze della comunità. Con Alastair Fuad-Luke stasera spostiamo il perimetro, diciamo così, della comunità, allargandola a una dimensione non solo che include l'essere umano, ma a una ricerca di una nuova convivenza multispecie. Alastair Fuad-Luke nasce come plant ecologist, lavora da tanti anni nel mondo del design come facilitatore, come design curator, tra le altre cose è stato curatore della Biennale di Porto del 2020. Lascio a lui la parola e buonasera.
Grazie mille Sara. E scusami, ma parlo in inglese tutto la notte. Altra Natura. It's a topic I've been thinking about for some time, perhaps, maybe all my life. I grew up in a small farming community in the north of England. And I was saying earlier today to Sarah over lunch, my playground was 10 kilometers in any direction. And if you think about that today, it's a profound shift in maybe how young people are experiencing what it means to be in nature or with nature. We ran a workshop this afternoon here. You can, after the talk, look at some of the outcomes from the workshop, but the participants are all there too. And it was a difficult conversation because we are, of course, nature. We should never have had this human-nature separation. It's a false separation because we are deeply embedded in nature. We even talk about it's in his or her or their nature, talking about a characteristic. So I go with my talk. I'm going to hand these books around because I guess some of my thinking over the last few years has been well, not even the last few years, these are all from the last 2 years. There is an essay, it's in Portuguese, called Altra Natura, for a project called Museu da Cidade. There is, sorry, I should show them to you. I'm going to pass them around so you can have a look at them, Altra Natura here. And there's an interesting lexicon in there because I believe we need new words to discuss this topic of alter nature. Then this is a little journal we did for the Porto Design Biennale called the Alter Journal. This one's about alter realities. We had 5 other issues. And here, some of my thinking around the Symposium, which I will describe in a minute, not the Anthropocene, but the Symposium, was formed here. This is a book published in August. It's called Field Explorations, Design and Arts-Based Practices Towards Viable Agricultures. And I hope it's designers and artists to think more about present and future agriculture. There's a hyphen between the two. And then this came out of the Biennale. It's just been published from a series of colloquia we did last year in Porto called Peripheral Perspectives. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, the title, because it says Post-Normal Design, Emergent Approaches Towards Plural Worlds. I just pass these round because as you as an audience, your thought kinds of things you read and different aesthetic experiences you have. So probably some of what you will hear from me tonight has come from these books and publications. Perhaps, Sarah, I could ask you to just spread them around the audience and possibly hand them back at the end, since these are the only copies I have. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. I have a dense talk, but I hope you all find a storyline. And I've invited Circolo del Design to share my talk, so you can go back into it again and look later. Maybe I start here because I'm just checking the time. 1 hour? Una hora, okay. I start with this term, a gentle realism, from Karen Barad. She's a physicist, actually. This was from a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And it describes how our material, discursive practices matter because they shape worlds. Maybe she didn't know it, but that's a good description of design. Material, discursive practices matter. They use matter as well, because they shape worlds. I think Tony Fry, the design philosopher, said it more succinctly: design designs. So the design of this room, the chairs, the space, everything's designing all our aesthetic experience, and it works in us. We, humans, and those beyond humans, non-humans, other than human, more than human, all have agency in world making. It's completely fallacious to think that, and arrogant to think that we humans make the world. It's always co-making. All, to use a Bruno Latour phrase, he means actants. All things are acting in making the world. I think Spinoza would have recognized this idea of actants, but he would prefer to call them conative bodies. So the world is full of bodies acting on each other. And when we consciously design, we change how those bodies act on each other. They can act on each other by giving, according to Spinoza, pleasure or pain. And we talked about it briefly this afternoon. So I don't know how many people consider themselves as a designer. I wasn't trained as a designer. I don't think I would ever claim that. But when we design, we can ask whether the bodies we design give pain or pleasure. And then we have to ask, to whom? And that is really my question tonight. And also, when we design, who are we really thinking of? Who do we include in we? So I move on. So this is kind of, I have 4 propositions here in the talk tonight. The dark side of progress. You'll get very depressed in that section. 2, reorientation. I will try to lighten your mood a little bit. 3, reworlding, past and present entanglements, because we have tried to reworld before. Those new entanglements. How do we go about co-living in what I've called the Symposium? I'll explain what that means later. So the dark side of progress. I have a number of topics I'm discussing here. A concept I have called the Great Separation, the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, extractivism, precarity and social justice, biodiversity decline, and globalization as a loss of multiple diversities. Globalization is a flattening of things, because globalization depends on homogeneous ideology. So we start with wonderful paintings by Albrecht Dürer, kind of photorealistic painting, and he chose to paint a hare, a leveret, and a piece of turf. Of course, he also did portraits and self-portraits, and that's probably where he earned his money. Probably these didn't sell, I don't think. Maybe just for his private collection. But why am I putting these up here? Because when he painted these in 1503, 1502, every European had some intimate contact with these living things. We were not divorced from them. We really had knowledge about. If you go and look in your folk song traditions, you'll find hundreds of songs about hares. It's not because it was a trend. They didn't have social media then. It's because everybody lived with hares. Everybody knew a hare, or had seen a hare, or knew somebody who had a dog that hunted hares. So these 2 works of art for me are very intriguing. They document a time when everybody had intimate contact with other living beings. This is my proposition. So I come onto this diagram, which is actually in the book, it's going round. I talk about the great separation. Is it visible at the back there? Can you see? Okay, yeah. The great separation. I'm not a graphic designer, as you can see, but anyway. We had the agricultural revolutions in the middle. Often the second Arabic revolution is forgotten. But we started a new agricultural revolution with the third European colonial. Part of colonialism was to take European agriculture and start planting European things on other people's land. Of course, it failed spectacularly often. And they had to start talking to the indigenous people who knew how to grow things. Then we had the fourth British agricultural revolution, which is about mechanizing, farming. And the fifth global, which is from the First World War onwards, when people got concerned about how do we feed. So these are the agricultural revolutions. Of course, we had the industrial revolutions at the top as well. So I argued that we had a great separation here. We had a great separation when agriculture started going colonial. The Anthropocene, I don't know. When did it start? Even the geologists can't agree. Was it when Neolithic peoples became sedentary? Was it when we had an oil economy? When we had the first nuclear accident? I don't know. They're all in disagreement as where the golden spike of this Anthropocene. But for me, the Anthropocene keeps us in the center. It puts us in the center. And I don't think we've made everything in the world. I come back to that point. Of course, there's some good descriptions here, some other scenes here. We have Jason Moore's Capitalocene, and we have Donna Haraway, another anthropologist's view of the Plantationocene. I'll give you the descriptions in a minute. These are coincidental, the idea of the plantation and the ideal of using capital to exploit colonial lands also marked this great separation, I think, where nature becomes instrumentalized purely for our purposes. I'm not saying it didn't happen before, but the scale was very, very different. So that's my proposition on the great separation. The Capitalocene, this is by a book of the same name by Jason Moore. He calls it a multi-species assemblage, a world ecology of capital, power, and nature. And the Plantationocene, this is by a meeting of anthropologists in 2015, so there were many people involved, but Haraway's name is at the top, Donna Haraway. The Plantationocene was the devastating transformation of diverse kinds of human-tended farms, pastures, and forests into extractive and enclosed plantations, relying on slave labor and other forms of exploited, alienated, and usually spatially transported labor. What we've ended up with is what some people are describing as a form of ecocide or terricide. This is a rather standard size warehouse for soybean production in Brazil. It's absolutely massive, the scale. I read an article today in the Guardian newspaper online. I don't know whether you're aware that Syngenta merged with Monsanto. The European Commission and North American authorities approved this merger. This gives this one company control of about 40% of the world's main agricultural seeds. One company. You should know that Syngenta is owned by 2 Chinese corporations. We're talking about world food here. So we manipulate the landscape. This is in Portugal where I live. It's in the Tejo Valley, parallel with Lisbon. And this is how we modify the landscape. Before we came along, the Tejo Valley was a naturally flooding, wide valley, a mixture of fresh water and salt water. Now it's highly controlled. Those circles are all irrigation circles. So we have definitely manipulated large parts of the world to provide food, which we can say is a good thing. But this kind of manipulation comes with some big negatives for other living beings. It's a world, too, that relies on extractivism. This still remains one of the world's biggest holes, and it's in Spain. It's an abandoned copper mine. Rio Tinto Zinc was, of course, a Spanish company originally. Now it's a transnational company. So a lot of our way of living relies on this process of extractivism. It's not always mountains disappearing and big holes. It's other forms of extractivism. If we go back here, we're extracting many things from the soil. In fact, there's a big world crisis on soils having so much extracted from them, the soils are becoming infertile. So extractivism is operating on many scales. This is the new extractivism, I would suggest. This is the Tesla factory, the gigafactory. You'll have spotted it's in the middle of a rural area or an area of low population. You'll also spot there's a huge car park there for all the employees to drive tens of kilometers to get to this distant factory. It was a cheap place to build a factory. We cannot honestly think that everybody in the world is going to own a Tesla and it's all going to be okay. This is an elitist infrastructure. You cannot replicate this for all people who have a car. And there are many people in the world who've never had a car. Near where I live in the north of Portugal, the area is called the Minho, and they found lithium there. And there's 6 places in Portugal where mining companies applied for licenses to mine lithium. It's not really economic in Europe. It's better to mine lithium where the quantities are absolutely huge. Anyway, the locals got together. Serra d'Água is an area of outstanding natural beauty and is gazetted as a reserve area. And it says no lithium, basically. And they won in this area, but there's 4 other licenses in Portugal where they might not win. So extractivism continues. If you add in artificial intelligence to extractivism, we're really moving on to a different scale of extractivism. Every time you click on your computer, the data is being recorded. And of course, we were locked down for COVID. People clicked a lot. They bought a lot more stuff. There's a migration now to more online shopping. This interesting book by Kate Crawford called The Atlas of Artificial Intelligence, she makes the claim that artificial intelligence is essentially a grand infrastructure project. It's an infrastructure that controls what gets extracted next. And when we talk about extraction, we cannot just talk about the extraction of resources, non-living resources, rocks, or the extraction of crops or animals. We have to talk about extraction from humans too, extraction of human labor from humans. In Mackenzie Walk's book, Capital is Dead, he cites Guy Standing, who notes that, okay, this kind of new infrastructure around artificial intelligence has also generated maybe a new, and our financial arrangements of the world have generated new classes. Before, I come from a very class-structured country. United Kingdom, it's highly class-structured, upper, middle, lower. But now we have these new classes. On the left here, Guy Standing suggests we have a plutocracy, we have a salariat, we have professions, professional and technical. I guess I'm in that category, professional and technical. We have working class. We have precariat. This is a new class about unsecure work. You have work for 2 days, and then you don't have any work. And you might work next week or the week after, but you don't know. The precariat. The unemployed, and then the lumpen precariat. They don't even really appear in the news stories, okay? And then Mackenzie Walk himself herself was talking about the vectoralist class. The vectoralist class is the people gathering all this AI data and deciding how the data works. What does it do next? Jeff Bezos doesn't need to own a single factory. He just has people telling him what they want to buy, and he just sources at the factory, and ideally keeps it for no time at all in his stock system. You don't need a factory today. That's old Industrial Revolution stuff where you built a factory. You need the information today. So this is the vectoralist class. You have the oligarchs. You have the hacker class. You have a whole new rentier class. England used to be called a nation of shopkeepers. Now it's a nation of landlords. People who own 2 or 3 houses and rent them out. And CEOs. They've always been a class of power, let's say in modern times anyway. So we're living in dark times, to borrow a phrase from Hannah Arendt, where social injustice is also part of the infrastructured and politicized systems. I walked through the Porta Palatine today, and there was a lot of Just Eat's courier delivery guys, mainly guys, all sat there waiting for their next order. You know, it's got an interesting juxtaposition. That was an entry gate, and here's these guys waiting to deliver food to people who've ordered it online. And of course, we have in Portugal and in Spain, we have all these stufas, these greenhouses where people are working on minimal wages and in semi-indentured labor conditions, and also extremely hot conditions. It got to 46 degrees in Santarém in the center of Portugal this summer. Imagine what the temperature was in the greenhouses. Unworkable. So as well as social injustice, we have this idea of mass extinction in the geological record. We know the dinosaurs were the 5th last great extinction. And if you look at the timeline here, 1800 to 1900, this is when it really kicked off. But it's actually earlier than that, 1600 to 1700. We go back to my idea of the Great Separation. When we started Europeans colonizing other lands, we scaled up the exploitation. You know, the first colony of the English was in Northern Ireland. They tested colonization. Elizabeth I, we've just had Elizabeth II passed on, but Elizabeth I was the first colonist. She tested some of the principles of colonization in Ireland. And so when the English went to America, it was just replicating more of the same. It's interesting. But I think this was a scaling up. When Europeans started the so-called discoveries, the Portuguese still use this word, we were scaling up exploitation. And of course it was based on new ideas of capital. The net result of this is massive biodiversity loss. You heard Sarah say that I started life as an environmental scientist and plant ecologist, so I often read scientific papers. This was a huge report looking at biodiversity all over the world. If you see an orange or red square with an arrow going up, it means the biodiversity loss is increasing. Orange or red means the biodiversity loss in these different habitats is increasing. This is Europe, from Western Europe right across to Central Europe, in huge parts of Russia too. There's only a few habitats where the biodiversity is not being reduced. If you look at American produce from 1900, I think, to the 1980s, these were the old varieties that used to produce, huge numbers of varieties, and now only by the 80s it'd come down to a few lines. And if you go to the Syngenta Monsanto story now, the number of lines of genotypes of seeds is reduced even more and is controlled by fewer people. So diversity is also autonomy. We shouldn't forget that. There's also a loss of language here. This is a map of Europe showing languages that are disappearing. And I would make the case that language is also a loss of understanding of life. If we lose languages, we're losing alternative descriptions of life. Because language is what we use to describe life. So, yes, I'm painting quite a dark and tragic picture. And just to finish off, I think, a couple of slides, this section. This is interesting. A colleague of mine, Matteo Moretti, and his work company Sheldon, did the graphic design for this. This is based on data being collected from points all over Europe, where they've collected temperature data since, when was it, 1960s. You can see actually that Eastern Europe, the hotter, the redder the color, the hotter they increase. In Torino here, you can see the graph too. It's increased 0.8 degrees. In Lisbon, which you can see just down to the bottom left, you see the whole area is red. There's parts of Lisbon that have gone up 4 degrees. 4 degrees since the 1960s. And this is the whole point with global warming. It's not equal. There are parts going to warm up. You see the whole southern Alps there is also red. It's a south-facing slope, of course, of a mountain range, so it's going to get hotter. And we have to say, we might have been here before. I just picked out this slide. I found it in an old talk. The artists were there long before, of course, pointing out this connection between these infrastructures of power, financial power, agriculture. This was Agnes Den doing her project, The Wheat Field, a confrontation. She's growing the wheat and harvested it on derelict land, which of course became very valuable real estate land. And the picture's a bit surreal because you see the Twin Towers in the background there. And of course the World Trade Center is another infrastructure of world capital and power. So we've been kind of confronting these things around these intertwined infrastructures, but I think with our modern way of organizing, especially our digital way, especially the way information is being gathered and controlled, that the problems are amplifying, and they're all interconnected. So, let's go home. We can't really do anything. But that's not what we agreed this afternoon. There are things we can do. We can reorientate. And I think this is, Jack Rancière puts it nicely in his book, Politics of the Ascetics, I think. When he talks about the distribution of the sensible, he says you have to challenge the aesthetic regime. I've shown you an aesthetic regime in the previous slides. We have to challenge that aesthetic regime and redistribute the sensible. The sensible is a mixture of things. It's how we think, it's how we perceive, it's how we act, and how we produce, or materialize, I would say. So we're at a point where we need to radically change how we think about distribution of the sensible. And I would propose to start with this guy, who was a radical philosopher, Baruch Spinoza. And I'm not going to read everything out there, but in his book, The Ethics, which was published after his death by friends, because it was too radical to be published in his lifetime, he basically proposed a world that was a monoism. Because he was living in a religious time, he had this phrase in the Ethics about God or nature, nature or God. He kept on just flipping it through the book. And he saw a world of bodies, interacting bodies that had an effect on each other. And of course we're a body, but inside our body we have other little bodies. We have many bacterium and other things that live within us. We have other living beings living within us. And they have an effect. And then, of course, we have other even bigger bodies. So it's a world of bodies interacting, giving pain or joy. I think this is a nice way to think about when we design. We change bodies. Which bodies are we changing? Who benefits? Who feels the burden of our design? Who is feeling the pain of our design? Who is feeling the joy of our design? So I would start here with an orientation. I would also point you towards Felix Guattari. He worked very closely with Gilles Deleuze, of course. And Felix Guattari, in his very small book called Three Ecologies, it's worth reading, proposed ecosophy. Ecosophy is about the individual subjectivity and our psyche, ecology of the mind. It's also about the ecology of the socius, the civic way of thinking. So it's also how we think collectively. And it's recognizing that the environment is in a continual process of reinvention. So these three spheres interact. Imagine three Venn circles. You as the individual person with subjectivity, the socius, our collective subjectivity, let's say, and the environment. And these all always interact. And with a lot of prescience, he wrote this book in 1989. He actually named something then that wasn't actually called neoliberal global capitalism, but he called it integrated world capitalism. And he already saw it linked up as a series of infrastructures of power. And he already saw that in 1989. We can say that that was the rise in Europe here of a neoliberal ideology related to capitalism. And he said this is the way we can start to contest it if we adopt this ecosophy or three ecologies. In the yellow book that's going around here, you'll encounter the writings of an anthropologist, Marisol de la Cadena. She's from Peru. And she says something important too, because I think our challenge, it was this afternoon in the workshop, and I think our challenge remains tonight, that we have to make, we as Europeans, I see we're largely kind of Europeans, or at least westernized, need to make a big ontological change. Maybe there's one way she suggests we can do that. She borrows from Louise Pratt to talk about contact perspective. This is a term used by anthropologists when two cultures meet each other, okay? There's a contact point. But that contact, of course, changes both. I don't know whether it's Spinoza's pain or Spinoza's joy that the two contacts receive, but it changes both. And she proposes this idea of pluriversal contact zones, where we need to go into places where we don't ontologically understand what is going on. We need to be in places where we don't know what the being is. I hope that makes sense. We need to feel ontologically displaced. And she calls this ontological excess. Okay, it's when... how many of you have spent any time with any culture that's labeled as indigenous? Have you spent any time? Okay, well you get these strange moments. I spent some time in Borneo, in the state of Sabah. It's a Malaysian state, and it has 30 or 40 different kinds of tribes. They have their own different languages. And of course you, like any linguistic problem, you try and reach to the same concept through modifying the language. But there's some concepts in the way they construe their ontology you can't reach through language. They have another way of seeing the world. A mountain has a spirit, a mountain has a presence, a mountain has a role in their everyday lives. For me, that's quite tricky. So this is what she means by ontological excess. So my advice today, after you've listened to my talk, may you agree and disagree with many things, but go and put yourself in a place where you feel ontologically challenged. Because we have to get out of our false ontological comfort. I use this phrase in the workshop today. Maybe I just unpack it. It's a neologism. Neologisms, where we bring different words together in English, is a very common technique. Co-becoming. So we have co, which means together. We have being, which we all understand. Maybe it's one of the fundamental existential ways. We have becoming, which is obviously not a fixed state, but it's an active state of becoming different. It's a process. And we have all these things together. Co-becoming means being with others and becoming different together. Am I losing everybody? Sorry, it's all about language tonight. And I think our being is always co-being. We can't become on our own. It's impossible. We're always becoming in reference to something. And we, who is the we? If we start to include other living things, where we can become with them, it changes dramatically what's possible for us too. Example I gave this afternoon is that we lived with horses very closely for 6,000 years. And if you go back 100 years, most people in this room would have a horse story. Because they knew them. Because they knew them by becoming with them. Do we do the same with cars? Yes, we become with cars too. But they are designed in a particular way. And maybe the relationship's not so reciprocal, though our cars can talk to us today, right? Yeah. So, as Donna Haraway noted, this biological concept of autopoiesis, where we are self-reproducing and autonomous, is not a useful concept. She says that actually all life is symbiotic. We are making each other all together. We can't do it any other way. So we're not just self-generating, but we're co-generating. And I think we do a lot of unconscious symbiosis. We are becoming with other things anyway. You're interacting with everything around you, all these bodies. You are becoming because of all these other bodies too. But it's not a conscious becoming. And I think if we want to change our relationship within nature, we have to make a conscious symbiosis. We have to consciously choose to be within nature differently. I give an example. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but this is Stefano Mancusi's, I saw this at the Milan Triennale, 2019, I think, wasn't it? And he had an exhibition about the nation of plants, which is a book, which is a book of 8 chapters. Each one is an article for a constitution for plants. And there's 8 of them. I'll just read out one. Article 2. The nation of plants recognizes and guarantees the inviolable rights of the community of nature as a society based on the relationships between the organisms of which it's composed. That sounds like equality and equity all in one go. Article 7 is quite interesting too, when you think about today's migration of humans. The nation of plants has no borders. Every living being has the freedom of movement and can resettle and live without any limitations. When we use the language of invasive species, when we use the language of migrants, it's not conforming to that article of the Constitution, for sure. But these are what I call ontological disturbances. It's even quite difficult to get our head around. How could we have a nation of plants? But as we talk this afternoon, laws are being modified in parliaments around the world to protect natural entities. Some rivers are protected now in law. Animals have certain rights in law too, and so on. This is another ontological disturbance by the artist Natasha Myers. I'm only going to read, it's called How to Grow Livable Worlds, 10 Not So Easy Steps for Life in the Planthropocene. So she says through these 10 steps that all life starts with plant life. We don't exist without plants, the fundamental part. Step 3, repeat this mantra, we are not alone, we are not alone, we are not alone. Looking back at the past 500 years of efforts to assert Western man's independence from and power over nature, it is clear that we, humans, should never be trusted to be alone. And there's other things here. This is about reorientation. I give you an economic model here because if we can reorientate philosophically, we can reorientate ontologically, but if we don't reorientate economically, not much will change. This is the book by Kate Raworth called Donut Economics. Basically it says if you fall in the hole in the middle, you fall into the hole of social injustice. And any good economic model shouldn't allow that. And if you go outside the donut, you destroy your wider environment. So this economy has to operate within the green part of the donut. It's simple logic, but I think a lot of what we do today doesn't conform to this economic model. We did some rethinking for a fashion-based research project I was doing. I don't know if you can read those, but the orange ones are monetary economies. These are all adjectives given to economies: political, planned, national. These are geopolitical economies: sectoral, creative, design, digital, environmental, bio, eco, green, clean tech. These are all monetary-based economies. On the far right, we have non-monetary economies. This is all about the work of G.K. Gibson Graham, the fantastic pair of economists, where they talked about alternative economies. If we still try and do an alternative to capitalism, it remains capitalist-centric. We remain stuck in trying to do the opposite of. But there are actually alternative economies that don't use the capitalist monetary systems. And then in the middle we have conceptual economies, transitional economies. Look, it's just a graphic. There's a lot of language there, but economists use these adjectives to describe economies. And we need different adjectives to describe the economies we really want. Donut economy is just one example. So I move on fast to the third section: reworlding, past and present entanglements. We need to move from this unconscious symbiosis, because we're all being made and we're all making each other unconsciously. We need to change that. And we need both a biological and a social symbiosis. Symbiosis is what happens in our stomachs every day. We have a symbiotic relationship between the bacterium that help digest our food and giving life to the bacterium whilst they still stay in our stomach. This is symbiosis, okay? We go back to Haraway. Symbiosis, the yoking together. Yoking means connecting together of companion species at the table together. Sympoiesis enlarges and displaces autopoiesis. Symbiogenesis is for becoming with each other in responsibility. She puts a hyphen there. What she means is we have to respond. We are sentient beings, not just intellectual, not just political. We are sentient. We feel. This is part of our response. An ability, of course, is our ability to change something. When I was working on this project called What Could a Farm Be, some of the examples are included in the book that's circulating called Field Explorations. I developed this diversity triangle here, based on Haraway's idea of a multi-species coexistence. Can we really coexist as multi-species? Well, I started thinking it through from anthro-diversity, human diversity, agricultural diversity, and biodiversity. And if we cross these over, what are we talking about? Maybe multicultures, intercultures, multi-agricultures, multi-bio-organic agroecology, multi-ecologies, rewilding, anthropocentric rewilding. I don't know. I just created this. This is a way of playing with the language. We need to think about diversity differently. We need to think about diversity going forward. This is a future cone. Maybe some of you in design are used to using this future cone. In the future cone, created by two engineers and health workers back in the 90s, they talked about possible futures, predictable futures, preferable futures. I'm just talking here about a preferable future. For me, a preferable future has to balance these three diversities: human diversity, agricultural diversity, and natural biological diversity. That's my preferable future. Of course, we have a past, because this bit is the present. We do have modes here: permaculture, agroecology, urban agriculture, eco-villages, ecological design, that have all tried to balance that a bit better. So we've tried, but it's not really working, if we're honest. Some eco-villages are 40, 50 years old. They still have communities. Findhorn in the north of Scotland is still going. But it's not a community that attracts a lot of people. It has no mass movement behind it. And I'm talking about an ontological shift that changes dramatically the way we might live. I'm going to give a few examples from the book that's circulating here, because I think we have contributors from the arts, design, anthropology, philosophy, and more. One part of the book is case studies, and this is, I have an open mind on all these case studies. But they're experiments. I think the point is they're experiments. And this is something I would argue we have to experiment with. We have to experiment with different relations between and with us and beyond human. This was a project done by Benedikt Gross, a German designer, called Avena plus Testbed. He used GPS satellites and positioning to get the tractor to go up and down, and it would stop the drill at certain points to create this pattern. Where it looks as if nothing was drilled, actually the drill was sowing at the same time wild flower seeds. So where you see the hexagons, wild flower seeds were put. And bottom right you can see the wild flowers. So you have corridors of wild flowers going through this agricultural crop. Actually, it's probably easy to do it in straight lines, but I liked the approach. This was all done by using GPS technology and shutting off the drill and putting on the flower seed drill. The tractor was driving up and down. It's quite complicated. But there are other ways we can do this. But this experiment was 3 or 4 years by a designer, 3 or 4 years before a Swiss institute decided they would test putting wildflower strips in straight lines in fields to see if it was better for biological insect control. Of course it was. You have more diverse insects in the wildflowers. An essay in the book here is exploring alternative food networks, and Chris Croyce is a graphic designer. I worked with him. He's a colleague in Bolzano. And there's a key on the side here. You have farmers in green, you have consumers in orange. And he developed this key. He was trying to map how are these food networks different. On the top left you have Latte Crudo, a network for distributing raw milk in Italy. And on the right you have the GAS, Gruppi Acquisiti di Solidale. And he did many more in this essay, it's in the book there, where he's trying to map what is the actual structuration of these networks. So this is an interesting contribution, I think. But we need to get more radical. I think we're really in, as I painted a rather dark picture, and I use this phrase again, co-living in the Sympocene. How can we make a better world by living better with beyond human, other than human, more than human? We can talk about regenerative design. We need to talk about design justice and a conscious sympoiesis and what I've called social infrastructuring. So in this little book that's also circulating at the moment, the Sympocene is something where I see designers. We're on a design institution now. Designers should seek new relations with new kin. Kin, we had this word this afternoon. Did we get to an Italian translation of kin? I can't remember. Not quite. Kin means like your blood relations. Oh, that sounds very, yeah, consanguini. Kin, anyway, this is a word from Haraway. So designers should seek new relations with a new kin, but Haraway was not just talking about humans. She was talking about kin as other living things. So a wider view of kin. And we should move beyond symbiosis towards this symphoiesis, a remaking of the world together. This, I believe, needs regenerative practices. Every time we design, we should ask, what does it regenerate? Only then can we consider that we're making all life. There's a Greek word for all life, zo. It means all life. We are in that description. Perhaps we shouldn't talk about humans and nature. We should simply talk about zo. We are zo. All in it together. So this requires a new relationality in design. I think we need to think about our relations with beyond human as social relations. When you see my neighbor in where I live in the north of Portugal has a horse, it's a wild horse, a Garano. When I see him talking to the horse, and the horse talking to him, essentially, they're communicating. It's a social relationship. It's social for the horse too. If you extend that idea when we design, how do we build these relations that create a sociality as well as an ecology? I can't even tell you what that might look like now, because I'm describing something I don't really see many examples of. But we should aim towards that. The description of regenerative design here, I gave it as a working definition, but I'm not going to spend time on it because I think I've already described. Regenerative design has to consider zo. It has to consider all the components. This idea of design justice, which is also in the little Altra journal circulating around, is also very interesting. Because in design justice, Sasha Constance Schock talks more from an anthropocentric point of view, but I think she says something that's really interesting too, that design that is just has to ask what is the distribution of benefits of the design, to whom, and who gets the burdens of design. So, how many mobile phones do you have in your house? I think I've got about 4 still in a drawer, you know. If I sent them back to the company and they sent them, there's one less, that one will go in the drawer now. If I sent them back to the company, they would just export them out of Europe because they have to deal with electronic waste, and they could end up being smashed up by some poor guy somewhere in the middle of China, and toxic chemicals everywhere, and so on and so on. So this design has some benefits and burdens. I make a simple object to show what I mean. So how can we find new livelihoods? Because if we're talking about this new relationship between what we design, and I'm talking about a livelihood is a very nice British word. It means not only the way you earn your living, but the way you live and work and play and interact. Livelihood. And this is a project in Italy by Bianca Elsenbaumer and Fabio Franz of Brave New Alps. It's in Vallegrina, in Trentino. And they worked with the community to try and design new ways of living that had multiple benefits to people and other living things. And this is their story here about its future work in a way. I would say Brave New Alps is underpinned by, Bianca's written a lot about the work of these economists, Gibson Graham, and using their model of alternative heterodox economics. And this may be something we'd all like to do, to redesign our economic lives. But this is designed also with other living things in mind. There's another project with them and the local community. They set up Community Frizzante. This is making sustainable drinks from local fruit, but it is foraged from the landscape, and people go out together and the community brings the fruit back, and so on and so on. So I'm calling this social infrastructure because for me, both these things are highly participative. And we have a long history in design of participatory design and co-design. So they're participatory. The processes and the ideas generated are collectively held. The designer is a facilitator. In the end, of course, the designer also designed the label on the bottle. So You know, I always think for those professional designers, they get worried that if other people start designing, we're talking about two different things. There's design as a process, and then there's designing so you can actually have a usable, functional, beautiful object. So, if you move towards this other way of designing, I would argue there's plenty of new work. You're just designing different objects. They come from a different process. They come from a different origin. And this is another example. This is from Mirka Holnaker. She's a student, was a student on the master's course in Bolzano, master's in eco-social design. And she did this beautiful project called Farmfluencers. She went and lived with farmers. She did ethnographic research. She understood that farmers want to share ideas, but they're often isolated individuals. But they often have their radio on as they go around their farm. And she created a series of podcasts by farmers who were trying to diversify their practices, more biological, more social, and so on. So she provided a mechanism. She went to record and interview these farmers and do the podcasts and put them on a radio, internet radio, and so that the farmers could listen to other farmers. There's no better thing than a farmer telling a farmer. If I tell the farmer the same thing as the bio-farmer, they will listen more to the bio-farmer, of course, even if we're saying exactly the same things. So this is a wonderful project too, and this was facilitation. What she did was design facilitation. And of course, many of these farmers in the South Tyrol area are experimenting with more extensive farming, ideas of lower input and more nature, of course. Then farmers themselves are also designers and participatory. This is a French network called L'Atelier Paysan, and they design machinery, often for biofarming or organic farming, extensive farming, that you can't buy on the market, because farm machinery is like any market. It's standard machinery, you know. And they design machinery for very specific purposes, maybe for sowing an old variety of bean or cabbage which doesn't fit the standard machine. They share the designs. Fantastic. This is another project which was Future Farmers, a Californian-based collective, but has got designers, architects, thinkers, philosophers. And they work with the Flatbread Society in Oslo in Norway, and they discovered old grains of wheat, and they traced the origins all the way back to the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. But they built a structure here, they grew these old strains of wheat in Oslo, and many things happened around there. This is facilitating conversations about other ways of living. Why is it important to have the old strains of wheat? It's important because they offer resistance, and they're not owned by these big seed companies that control all the infrastructure of the seed supply. And seed swapping has always been in farming. You know, it's illegal under international law to create these transgenic seeds where you create a crop, but the seed is infertile, so it's edible, but it doesn't produce the next crop. It was made illegal back in 2008, 2009, internationally. But apparently it's been experimented on in Brazil, in dark, hidden corners. They're still trying it. This is madness, to create a seed that doesn't produce the next crop, but you have to buy the same transgenic seed from the same company. This is madness. It doesn't make sense. There are some valleys up in Switzerland that have a mixed, the same genotype, but mixed varieties of wheat. So in one field you'll have short wheat, tall wheat, wheat that does well in dry, wheat that does well in wet, and they harvest this. It's a very special bread. What we've done is done the opposite. One variety, it's risk all or fail all. It's win all or fail all. So I got to move on. We had a whole theme in the Biennale on alter care, and I think we learnt a lot from the way indigenous communities think about care. We had the word care this afternoon in our workshop. So, designers care, yeah. Can we think of design as care? Can we think of design as regenerative? We have to if we're going to build new social and ecological relationships within nature. This is another project, the Archive of Vibrant Matter. I had an exhibition in the Biennale called the Museum of Vibrant Matter. And this was an open archive. It's still online, and it's about materiality in the local territory around the metropolitan area of Porto. And citizens were able to submit matter or materials that they found. And it's very interesting. We have these different categories. We built this very rapidly. It's really a beta version. We didn't have much time to organize the Biennale. But we had one category here about movement of materials. We created this hyper-local, local, immigrant materials, emigrant materials, transient materials, and omnipresent materials. In the category omnipresent, you see the electronic technology. It's all over the world. And you see microplastics all over the world. There are other things we can put in that category. So this is another way of thinking about our materiality when we are using beyond human resources, okay? When we're designing, we're always using beyond human resources, and human, of course, too. We exploit humans through design as well. We have to think differently about the materialities. If you want to go and read the speculative materialists, Jane Bennett and so on, they're the ones that point out that matter is vibrant, alive. And of course, Bennett refers right the way back to Spinoza. She has to. And then this book, which is a tongue-in-cheek title, as I said, Post-Normal Design, came from these colloquia. And the book challenges normalized ways of designing with the current global neoliberal economic situation by proposing the concept of post-normal design as an exploratory attempt to confront the damage. My first section of the talk tonight was all about the damage, and to reframe both the discipline and the profession. And I think we have to, because the normal way of designing, which I really showed in the first sequence of slides, in the first section of my talk, is not creating viable futures for us or for other than, more than, beyond human. So design also needs to think, if we're going to deal with this Altra Natura, alter nature, about assemblages. Assemblages, this term came from Deleuze and Guattari. This grouping, ad hoc grouping of diverse elements, of vibrant materials of all sorts. Assemblages that are living, throbbing confederations, have uneven topographies. Power is not distributed evenly. Assemblages are not governed by any central head. The effects generated by an assemblage are emergent properties in their ability to make something happen. As designers, we bring together different assemblages, and we change parts of an assemblage. And now we need to ask ourselves, what do we consider is our assemblage when we're designing something? If you're designing a chair, what is the extent of your assemblage? Who's in it? Who benefits from it? Who gets a burden from this chair, or this chair, or this computer, or this water bottle? So I talk about assemblages of care. They are both actors and actants. They're farmers, scientists, citizens, cooperatives, politicians, designers, dreamers, plants, soil, living beings. But we need all these people too, around the outside. I described myself this afternoon in the workshop as an indisciplinary specialist. Indisciplinary, a term from Jacques Rancière. I don't care about the disciplines. You can label me what you want. I don't care about the disciplines. I think they all have fantastic things to offer, but they offer more when they cross over, because they give a better understanding of feeling of what we're already feeling as humans, that the world is complex and any one discipline can never describe it. Not even the thick descriptions of the anthropologists can get close. or the deep penetrative work of the scientists, or of the linguists. We need to cross over these disciplines. Let's put it on to a modern challenge. This is from a book called Rewilding European Landscapes by researchers, Portuguese researchers in a German research institute. And if you look at Portugal, it's that little funny country on the left of the Iberian Peninsula, and I told you I'm living between Porto and the north, in two places I live. And the deeper the green here, they are suggesting these are good areas for rewilding. Why? Because these are areas of agricultural abandonment. Behind where I live, I walk into the woodland, and you see the old terraces of the agriculture. It's what happens here in Italy too, right? You can see all down the Apennine ridge there, abandoned agriculture, okay? You see in the valley of the Po, it's not abandoned. Although after the dry summer you had, maybe a few will think about abandoning agriculture because the River Po dried up, right? So this is an interesting project. And for me, this is a kind of form of design thinking because we've mapped it. Every map is a piece of design. It's a construct. It changes our perception of things. There is an organization, of course, called Rewilding Europe, and they've just completed a big project in the Netherlands where they've rewilded a river back to what they think it was, because they never really monitored what it was before. Netherlands was all drained and rivers were straight, and they're doing a project in the Rio Douro area in Portugal, the Coa Valley. In the Coa Valley, you have these prehistoric drawings on rocks. They're incisions on rocks. It was nearly flooded with a barrage, a dam project. So they're doing a rewilding project there. But I would suggest that what we have to really start is to rewild ourselves, isn't it? That's where we should start. Rewilding ourselves. I'm not sure how we begin it, but I think that's where we should start. Of course, there's small things we could do. I just pulled out a few projects here from Bolzano. My project, What Could a Farm Be? We were looking at utilizing waste wool here. We're looking at waste products from the apple industry, the skins and everything, to make packaging. Using you have a special phrase here in Italian, quinta quarta, the fifth quarter of the cow. This is the part that is thrown away. But actually you can cook a lot of things from it. So a student did a project about not wasting the cow, honoring the cow by using everything. If you go down to the Alentejo, where they have black pigs underneath the cork trees, it's quite a highly sustainable system called montado. The pigs graze on the acorns, they get nice and fat and tasty pork. When they kill a pig in the village, everybody comes, they use everything. They use everything. They eat almost everything. So we can do these kind of microscale projects, sure, through design. We can try and ameliorate our cities. This won a prize recently. I'm not sure it deserved a prize. I don't know. But it's symbolic. We are trying to find ways to ameliorate our impact and give homes to others. This gives homes to others. This is social housing for insects. But we need to be much more radical than this, I think. I don't know. Can we start thinking? This was a proposition, top right, I remember it from MIT, an MIT project, Joachim Hals. No, I can't remember the name of the guy now. But he was suggesting we start growing our houses. So when you have a young child, you start growing the house. So when they're an adult, they have a house to live in that's been made by the plants. Okay, I don't know how realistic that is. Down the bottom here, you have in Italy one of the biggest 3D printing machines. This is a 3D printed structure using soil. We can make woven structures, living structures. But I still think we need to go much more radical than this. Unfortunately, that's where my talk ends. But maybe it just begins here, because if we really start to think about design as care, regenerative design, when we design, who gets the benefit, who gets the burdens, who is we? These are all, for me, profound questions around designing. And I think if we can get the right questions, we can produce the most amazing designs. Of course, the minute they're already here as an image, so I've planted them into your imaginary now. Seeds in your imaginary, perhaps. But also to really convince people we need to experience it. And that's why I think designing with others, in real places, in real time, is also a very powerful aesthetic experience. I'm not sure I've answered what I set out to answer. Altra Natura, I see we have a big disconnect. We have a big disconnect because what we're actually doing to the world with these very large systems that scale up and keep extracting is causing huge damage and huge burdens. And we shouldn't be too grand to think that designers on their own can change that. But designers can, I believe, act in a more indisciplinary way with other disciplines. And this is where there's a nice productive tension. And so that's where I leave it. I think I've gone over 5 minutes or so because I'd really like to hear what you think. And please download the talk and have a look at it in your own time. There's a lot of language there, but I also believe we need new language. So I'm not making apologies for a lot of new words. And if you get time, have a look at the things we generated in the workshop here. Because we asked the question, how do we, in brackets humans, with beyond humans, tie ourselves together better? This was a really nice question we got this afternoon. How do we tie ourselves better to beyond human? This is a connection. We talk about the marriage knot, you know, where people used to have their hands bound together. That's what it means to tie, okay? To tie a rope, to make things secure, to connect. How does design tie things together better? My final words. Thank you.